Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you've all had a good week. So, we're heading into spooky season. I mean, we're already in spooky season, aren't we? Halloween is definitely fast approaching. And I thought today's case was definitely a good fit for spooky season. And I recently stumbled across this case. I wasn't looking for cases or anything like that. And I recently stumbled across it because I was reading an article. I can't remember what it was called, but it was something like 10 haunted houses, blah, 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 something like that. Do any of you guys get sucked into those articles like top 10 haunted places, top 10 haunted houses? And on that article about the haunted houses, there was one house in particular that stood out to me because there was a really tragic, heartbreaking murder that occurred. And that is what we're going to be doing today. Today, we're going to be covering the case of the Corpsewood Manor murders. I mean, the name alone, Corpsewood Manor, is what initially drew me to this case. But this case happens back in the 80s, and the manor was owned by an eccentric couple, Dr. Charles Scudder and Joey Odom. The mansion is very gothic. There is a pink gargoyle outside. There was also stained glass windows with pentagrams in them. And there were all of these rumors and stories swirling around town about Corpsewood Manor and about the owners, saying that they were evil devil worshippers, that they would perform satanic rituals, they would have wild sex parties. And then one day, two evil people, Avery Brock and Tony West, stumbled across Corpsewood Manor, and this soon led to the terrible events of today's case. And there are a lot of rumours around Corpsewood Manor still to this day. Not everything is completely known, and that is what makes this case so infamous and spooky and haunted, etc. And we have a lot to unpack today, definitely a lot to unpack. It's going to be a little bit confusing at times, I'm not going to lie, because there are a lot of rumors surrounding this case, and it was kind of difficult to actually figure out what is fact and what is fiction in today's case, but bear with me. I've tried to make it as simple as possible, and let's just jump in. So I just want to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, and that is G5 Games. G5 Games are the developers of so many amazing mobile adventure games, such as Hidden City, Homicide Squad, Jewels of Rome, and my personal favorite, Sherlock. Sherlock is an adventure puzzle game, but with a twist. Inside the game, the plots of really well-known stories such as Alice in Wonderland and Wizard of Oz have been turned upside down. The villains are scheming to destroy the worlds of those really well-known books, and you need to play as Sherlock along with the help of Dr. Watson to solve the mystery and put those worlds back together again. And I just love this game. The graphics are incredible, the storyline is amazing, and it's also not too fast-paced. So the game is not going to stress you out. It's a game that you can play to relax, and it's just so fun seeing all of the characters and the scenery from the stories of Alice in Wonderland and the Wizard of Oz brought to life in the game. But it's not just that, the game is full of all different kinds of puzzles to keep your brain going. Whether it's Hidden Object or Match 3, there are so many different challenges to complete. And you guys know by now that these kinds of games are my thing. I love anything like this because I play games to escape, to distract myself. So I don't want a stressful game, and that is what I love about these, that it just completely distracts me, and also I can relax at the same time. All of the G5 games have regular events and free updates, and if you create a G5 Friends account, you can sync progress across multiple devices. You can also chat and play with friends and receive exclusive deals and discounts. And also, right now, G5 Games are celebrating their 21st anniversary, and this means they have fun activities, free gifts, and special discounts available across all games. So now, because of all the amazing discounts and free gifts and fun activities, now is definitely your time to go and check out G5 Games. And if you click on the link in my description box or scan the QR code that is on your screen right now, you can go and download my personal favorite, which is Sherlock, or any of the other amazing G5 games. And also don't forget to check out exactly what anniversary offers they have in store. Thank you again to G5 Games for sponsoring today's video, but thank you to every single one of you watching right now, because truly without all of you guys, I wouldn't get opportunities like this. And now let's jump into today's case. So like I mentioned in the intro, we have two evil people that we need to address in this video, Tony West and Avery Brock. So we're going to start with Tony first. We're going to go into his background first because he's definitely the more dominant one out of the two. Tony West was born on the 11th of August 1952, making him a Leo. He was the only son out of 5 children, and he grew up in Anderson, Indiana, before moving to Rock Spring in Georgia when he was 9. Now, we don't know too much about Tony's background. We do know a decent amount, but we don't know like the ins and outs. But there was definitely a couple of significant things that we do know about. Now, the first thing, and this happened when Tony was 10 years old, his dad died following a horrific car accident. And it was a pretty horrific accident. The car went off the road, it fell down a 60-foot ditch, went into a telephone pole, and the car completely crushed, and this crushed Tony's dad. And of course, losing a parent anyway is very traumatic, but the accident was so horrific, it was just horrible. So that obviously would have had an impact on his life. And then the next thing to happen was that his mom got remarried to a very strict police officer. And his new dad kind of just came into the house and bulldozed and took over everything and just started putting all of these rules in place, and he was really strict. He wasn't the nicest, and it resulted in Tony and his stepdad getting into a lot of fights and arguments. But those two things were not the most significant thing that happened in Tony's childhood. Oh no. Prepare yourselves for this. So Tony, at the age of 13, shot and killed his 2-year-old nephew. Yeah, you heard that right. I know, when I first heard that, I was completely sidetracked as well. I was like, what? Now, Tony was playing with a loaded gun, which he then deliberately pointed at his 2-year-old nephew before pulling the trigger. Now, Tony later claimed that this was an accident. He didn't actually know that the gun was loaded. And the only reason that he pointed the gun at his nephew was to show his nephew that there was nothing to be scared of. And we obviously cannot prove either way exactly what happened. All we know is that Tony did pull the trigger. And it's just like, well, if you're trying to show your nephew not to be scared of guns, regardless of it being unloaded, why would you pull the trigger if you didn't want to harm him? Now, following this, even though Tony claimed that it was an accident, he was arrested, and because he was only 13 when it happened, he was sent to a child institution where he was until the age of 18. So that was Tony's very concerning childhood. So then he's 18 and he is released from this institution, and he pretty much jumps into a life of crime. He started with petty thefts. He then went on to more serious robberies. He was charged on multiple occasions for bail jumping, and then by the age of 22, Tony found himself back in prison on a 2-year sentence. But did Tony learn his lesson? Of course not, because in that 2-year sentence, Tony actually escaped from prison. I swear, how does this happen so often? There have been so many cases now that I've covered where I talk about someone escaping from prison. It's like, seriously, what the hell? So Tony escapes from prison and he's on the run for 5 years. Seriously, how? Because Tony is not exactly the brightest bulb in the box. How the hell did he manage to go on the run for 5 years and no one find him? But that is not the worst of it. In those 5 years, he managed to get married and have 5 children. How? But anyway, Tony's little cozy family life that he had built for himself wouldn't last for long, because it wouldn't be long until Tony found himself back in prison. Because at the age of 27, Tony was charged with attempted murder because he had shot his brother-in-law 4 times. I know, he has tried to murder another family member. It's like, this confirms to me that he did intend to murder his nephew earlier on. So this whole situation came about because Tony and his brother-in-law Kenneth were playing a game of poker, and the whole family were around. Like, it was a little family get together, like children running everywhere. It wasn't just the two of them playing poker. And all of a sudden an argument breaks out between Kenneth and Tony, clearly over the poker. I don't know what the argument was about. And Tony pulls out a gun and points it at his brother-in-law. Kenneth immediately tries to get away. He does run away. But Tony, as Kenneth is running away, manages to shoot him 4 times. Once in the stomach, once in the head and then twice in the back. And amazingly, Kenneth survived this, obviously, because he was only charged with attempted murder, but I don't know how. He has been shot 4 times, once in the head, twice in the back, and once in the stomach. It is literally a miracle that he survived that. So you would think, okay, so he's been charged with attempted murder. He also has prior records. Maybe we should put him away for a decent amount of time. But it never works out like that, does it? Because Tony was only sentenced to 3 years. 3 years for attempted murder. Again, what the actual hell? So in 1982, when he is aged 30, he is again released from prison, and that is when this case takes place. So after he leaves prison, he does find himself unemployed and he lives in a trailer, and he decides to get himself a roommate who is 17-year-old Avery Brock, who is the other evil perpetrator in today's case. So that was Tony's background. Not exactly a good one, is it? I mean, he has tried to murder 2 family members and he was obviously successful. He murdered his 2-year-old nephew. And I know he said that it was an accident, and I know he was only 13 years old when it happened. And if that was just an isolated incident, I could maybe buy into the whole story of it being an accident. But the fact that he has also tried to murder his brother-in-law over something so small as a disagreement over a poker game, I think tells us everything. So that is the kind of person that we are dealing with today. Someone that is extremely hot-headed, someone that really overreacts and resorts to violence very quickly. So just keep that in mind. That is the kind of person we are dealing with today. So now let's move on to Avery and his background. So Avery's name is actually Kenneth Avery Brock, but he goes by the name Avery, so that is what we're going to be calling him. He was born in 1965. An exact date of birth is not known. He grew up in Walker County, Georgia, where he lived with his parents, his brother, and his 4 step-siblings. Now, Avery also had a pretty troubled childhood. It's actually very similar to Tony's, apart from he didn't murder anybody, but they are very similar, because when Avery was 7 years old, his dad also died, and I think it was a shock to the family. He died from a bleed on the brain, and then soon after, his mom did get remarried to a very strict man. So like I said, very similar backgrounds, almost eerily similar. But Avery's stepdad was worse, because Tony's stepdad, yes, he wasn't a nice person, and yes, he was very strict and overbearing, but Avery's stepdad was abusive. He used to physically abuse Avery, and Avery would often be on the receiving end of beatings from his stepdad, which Avery has said that he tolerated willingly to protect his mom, because the more his stepdad beat on Avery, the less he would beat on his mom. This went on for years. This kind of abuse went on for a very long time. However, eventually Avery did get kicked out of the house by his stepdad at the age of 17, and then Avery found himself homeless. He resorted to living on the street and stealing to get by, and Avery didn't have a good childhood at all. He didn't even really have a childhood. Avery said himself, quote, "I've never been to a sports game, never been to a music concert, never eaten in a restaurant, never had a driving license, didn't go to prom." And at the age of just 17, Avery felt beat down by life. He just felt like, what was the point? What was life? And it is at this point, when Avery is feeling very low, that he meets Tony West. And this changed everything. Now, Tony is 13 years older than Avery. And I do actually think that this age difference plays a big part in today's case, because I definitely think Avery saw Tony as a father figure, because neither one of them, let's be honest, have had a father figure in their life. Both of them lost their dads very young, and then both of them didn't have a good stepdad. But Avery being 17, I definitely think that he looked up to Tony and saw him as a father figure, or at least an older brother. And even with the 13-year age gap, they became very close. They became inseparable. Tony did take Avery under his wing, which on the surface sounds really nice, doesn't it? Tony has seen this 17-year-old, he needs help, he needs guidance, he's taken him under his wing. That's really nice. But remember who we're dealing with here. Remember the kind of person that Tony is. And Avery is not innocent himself, okay? So Avery ends up moving in with Tony in this trailer. So they're both living together now. And their trailer is located just outside of Tryon in Georgia. And they are both mainly unemployed. They both work a few odd jobs here and there to survive, but they're mostly unemployed. Neither one of them has that much money, and they definitely are struggling. The two of them most of the time just spend their days getting high on whatever they can get their hands on, basically, which was usually a concoction of they called it Tootaloo. I don't actually know if that is the actual name of it, but they mainly got high off Tootaloo, which was a mixture of paint thinner and glue, and then they would inhale this concoction. And I've never heard of that concoction before. Like, obviously I've heard of glue sniffing and all stuff like that, but I've never heard of Tootaloo. I didn't even know it was a thing. But apart from getting high off Tootaloo, which was pretty much every day, they didn't really do anything else with their time. But all of that was about to change because Tony started to hear all the crazy rumors about this strange and creepy manor in the middle of the woods. And of course, that was Corpsewood Manor. And the rumors about Corpsewood Manor are absolutely just over the top, so extreme. Tony heard that Corpsewood Manor was this mysterious castle. Like, some people actually did call it a castle, and I can kind of understand why they called it a castle, because if you look at pictures of Corpsewood Manor, it definitely has castle vibes. So the rumors around this mysterious castle were that the owners would throw these crazy, wild sex parties, and that the people involved in these parties would be drug fueled, and the home was open to anyone that wanted a good time. Like, it was kind of like an open house kind of situation. So Corpsewood Manor, the fact that there was all of these rumors surrounding it, the fact that it was in the middle of nowhere and it was located just outside of a really small town in Georgia, Corpsewood Manor was the talk of the town. It was literally all anyone could talk about. And I feel like we can all imagine it, can't we? I mean, these small towns, they do tend to gossip, you know? And when anything is a little bit out of the ordinary, against the norm, etc., people tend to gossip, people tend to make up rumors, and that is exactly what they did with Corpsewood Manor. And Corpsewood Manor was owned by a couple, Dr. Charles Scudder and Joey Odom. And Charles and Joey would often invite the local residents of the town to their home for parties to have a good time. But there wasn't just the rumors about the sex parties and the drug-fueled parties and all stuff like that. Oh no, because there were lots of other rumors about Corpsewood Manor, but particularly about Charles and Joey. Pretty much everyone in town thought that Charles and Joey were secret devil worshippers. The town believed that Charles and Joey held these satanic rituals, and all of the guests that ever went to Corpsewood Manor were put under a full medical examination, and there were satanic rituals that went on, and there was these really wild sex parties. But please bear in mind that a lot of this is rumour, and Tony and Avery would soon visit Corpsewood Manor themselves. However, they were not looking to have a good time. They were not looking to party or anything like that, because of course they had more sinister ideas in mind that led to the absolutely horrific events of today's case. But before we get to the tragic events of today's case, for everything to make sense, we actually need to look back at Charles and Joey and their background. And they are obviously the current occupants at Corpsewood Manor, and we need to look into the rumours around Corpsewood Manor. Were they true? Were they not? Okay, so let's first look at the background of the first occupant at Corpsewood Manor, who was a man called Charles Scudder. Charles was born in 1926, and he grew up in a very, very wealthy family in Wisconsin. And Charles was very intelligent from such a young age, and he was also in a very privileged position that his family could give him a very good education. Like, there was no money spared when it came to his education, and he ended up getting multiple degrees when he finally went to college. He got degrees in zoology, he got degrees in various languages. He then also had a degree in chemistry before then getting a PhD in pharmacology. So I think smart is an understatement when we come to Charles. Charles went on to have 2 marriages, and the second marriage he did have 4 sons. And he also found work as a research scientist at the University of Chicago. And his job at the university was not really like the most conventional, especially at the time, because he was working on government funded research where he was researching the effects of LSD, and he was working with like government graded strength LSD. So yeah, pretty unique career. And there's one more pretty significant thing about Charles, and that is pretty much everyone around him described him as eccentric. And he was described as eccentric because he basically didn't fit the mold of a scientist. And this is in the 1970s. So like I've already mentioned in this case, when anyone is not normal, they're eccentric. So Charles would wear pretty big chunky necklaces. He would wear very bold, very colourful, very statement clothes. He also dyed his hair purple, and he also had a pet monkey. Having the pet monkey, yeah, definitely eccentric, but everything else, not really eccentric, but back in the 70s it was, and especially for somebody in his career, because it was a pretty prestigious job, it was a pretty formal job, but he used to just turn up with purple hair. And that is definitely something to know about Charles, is that he lived authentically to himself. He wanted to live his life the way he wanted to live it, and other people didn't really like that. And Charles went on to have a very successful career for many years, and he also earned a lot of money, and he was able to purchase himself a really huge mansion in Chicago. And it was in this mansion that he lived with his second wife and his 4 sons. So that was Charles's background. And now we need to move on to the background of Joey Odom, who was the second occupant at Corpsewood Manor, and how ultimately Charles and Joey ended up together. So Joey was born in 1938. He was 12 years younger than Charles. And it's said that he had a completely different upbringing to Charles. He came from a very poor family, and he didn't have access to the kind of education that Charles did. However, eventually Joey discovered that he had a passion for cooking, and he was naturally gifted at that. So it was in 1959, when Charles was 33 and Joey was 21, that Charles hired Joey to be the personal chef and housekeeper for his huge mansion in Chicago. Now, the timeline of exactly what happens now is not clear, but what we do know is that Joey was working as a personal chef and a housekeeper for Charles for roughly about 17 years. And at some point in those 17 years, Joey and Charles did enter into a relationship. Now, it's said that because of the time, the stigma of same-sex relationships, Joey and Charles did keep their relationship secret for quite a while, which is why we don't really know the events of what happened, which is why we don't really have a clear timeline, because we actually don't know when the relationship started because they did keep it quiet. But what we do know is that it's 1976. Charles is currently 50 years old, and at this point he has left his wife. All 4 of his sons are adults now. They have all moved out of the house, and Joey and Charles are now in a relationship. So that is how Joey and Charles first met, and now they are both living in this huge mansion on Chicago's west side. So how exactly do they end up at Corpsewood Manor? So Charles, like I said, is currently 50 years old, and he had become completely disillusioned with his life. He was completely fed up with his work, especially the office politics. He was just over it. He just was like, oh, this is just so stupid and petty. I'm done with this. Like, why am I still dealing with this? He was fed up of living in the city, of just city life, the hustle and bustle. And he was also just completely fed up with the stigma surrounding same-sex relationships. He was in a relationship with Joey, and he wanted to be open about that. He wanted to scream it from the rooftops, but he couldn't. And he also realized that the only thing that made him happy in life now was Joey. Being with Joey and kind of tinkering around the garden and just doing the odd little jobs. And after some soul-searching conversations with Joey, Charles just decided, you know what? I want to start again. I want to hit the reset button. I just want to start over. I just want to move somewhere new. I want to be who I am. I want to be open about who I am. And this is when Charles decided that he wanted to go off grid. He wanted to just completely not disappear, but he wanted to go off grid. He was just fed up. He didn't want to pay electricity bills anymore. He didn't want to pay taxes. He didn't want to go to supermarkets anymore. He wanted to grow his own food. He was fed up of the city. He just wanted to live off the land. And that was that. Charles handed in his resignation at the university. He sold that big mansion, and he used that money to buy 40 acres of land in some remote woods in Georgia. So they set off for their land now in the middle of the woods, and they make all of these plans on building their new home, which would ultimately become Corpsewood Manor. And they built this home completely by hand, brick by brick. And neither one of them, Charles or Joey, were construction workers. Neither one of them had any kind of knowledge or experience of building anything. But remember, Charles is very smart and he read a book about how to build a house and he just built a house. It's like, who can do that? Who can read a book about building and architecture and all stuff like that and just be able to do it? Like, that just fascinates me. I wish I could do that. And they built this home, and it's not like it was just like this little, like, 1-story little shack or anything. Oh no, this was a 2-story huge mansion, and Joey and Charles built this all themselves by hand. They laid over 45,000 bricks, and it took them months. It did take them a very long time because it was just the two of them doing it. And for most of the time while they were building it, they were just living in their camper van in the middle of the woods, which, side note, really freaks me out. Like, I don't think I could do that, staying in a camper van in the middle of the woods. Oh no. But after building for months and months, they had their home, and I'm gonna tell you now, it is impressive when you actually realize that this home was built by two people that had no idea what they were doing before. They have no experience in building. It is impressive. And something that is really interesting about the house is that it had no corners. The walls were all rounded. Like, it wasn't a round house, but the corners, there was no corners. It was all rounded, which, side note, would be a nightmare to decorate. Like, I couldn't even imagine. Like, you need a corner, you know, you need corners. But there was a rumor as to why the house didn't have any corners. And apparently Charles didn't want any corners because evil spirits can lurk in corners, which is why he wanted everything rounded. And I don't know if that is true or not, but that was the rumor. So the house is pretty impressive, but it didn't have any running water. It had no electricity. It had no phone lines or anything like that. But this is exactly what Charles wanted. He wanted to live off the land and he wanted to just live his life, you know, no one bother him. And then one last thing. The house is called Corpsewood Manor. And you may be thinking, okay, so how did it get that name? Well, I'm going to tell you. So the story goes that when Charles and Joey first drove onto their land, there was a dead horse in the middle of the road, which is really sad. That's just horrible. So they decided to call the road that led up to their home Dead Horse Road. And then following that, because they were obviously in the middle of the woods, and because the trees around their manor were really bare, they had no leaves on basically, that is what then inspired them to call the home Corpsewood Manor, because the trees were essentially dead. Corpse, wood, you get it? So that is how Corpsewood Manor was born. And Charles and Joey move in and they're living their best life. They're living the life that they have always wanted. They had their 2 dogs with them as well, and they adored their dogs. They were living off the land. They were living off grid. They were not bothering anyone. You know, they were just living their lives, keeping to themselves, and they were happy. Joey as well, being a really good chef, he was able to kind of cook up anything, whip up anything with the food that they grew. And Joey cooked everything in this wooden stove that they had, and they were just so happy, and they lived like this for 6 years, just living their best life, and they were happy. So now let's address some of the rumors around Corpsewood Manor. So the sex parties and the devil worshipping. So during the time that Charles and Joey were living in Corpsewood Manor, Charles was starting to miss the company of others. When he lived in Chicago, he worked at a university and he was interacting with people all the time. He was interacting with fellow academics, people that he found really interesting, and that is something about Charles. He loves being around people. He loves talking to people and learning about other people. He loves to pick apart people's brains. And now that is one thing that he was missing in his life now that he was living off grid. So Charles started to invite people from the town to his home, and people from the town would go to Corpsewood Manor. Charles and Joey made their own wine, which they offered to the local residents, and they just had little get-togethers. Now, after a while, it's said that Charles realized that he actually didn't like guests in his own home, because he was obviously just inviting strangers to his home, and he didn't want strangers in his home. He didn't want strangers poking about his business, possibly stealing things. Guests would sometimes break things, make things dirty, and Charles didn't want that. He poured his whole life into this home, building everything, and he didn't want local residents to come and ruin it. So Charles and Joey decided to build a whole nother building to entertain guests in. And this building was a 3-story chicken house, and it is this building that is very infamous in today's case. So the first floor in the chicken house was used to hold chickens, hence the name, the chicken house. The second floor was used to store canned goods and also the couple's large pornography collection. And then the third floor was called the pink room, also known as the pleasure chamber. And this floor was the most infamous of them all. Now, this room, the pink room, wow, there are so many rumors about this room. The rumors were that Charles and Joey had an open relationship and they would invite people from the town into their pink room and they would have wild sex parties. And the pink room was filled with mattresses and candles and sex toys. And when I say the pink room, it was called that because everything was pink. The walls were pink, the furniture was pink, the mattresses were pink, everything was pink, so it was called the pink room. And there was even more rumors on top of that. There was apparently a logbook that guests would sign before they entered the pink room, and they would write down their sexual preferences. And before guests were even allowed in the pink room, Charles would carry out a full medical examination on them. And there was just a lot of rumors, and most of it was rumors. Most of it was. On this case, there were definitely more credible sources that said something different. And these more credible sources said that Charles and Joey did used to invite people over, and they did used to invite people over to their pink room. But the pink room was actually just used for tea parties. It was just used for people that were like-minded to get together, to chat, to share wine, share stories. And the room just happened to be pink. It just happened to have pink furniture in, so Charles and Joey just named it the pink room just because it happened to be pink. And just because it was this pink room, it doesn't mean that it was for wild sex parties. Now, what the truth is, we don't know. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So those were the rumors about the sex parties, but what about the devil worshipping? Well, a lot of these rumors started because Charles actually did like satanic imagery, and Corpsewood Manor was covered in it. He had pentagrams painted onto the doors of his Jeep. There were pentagrams on various books in the house. There was even a stained glass window in Corpsewood Manor that had a pentagram in it. But not just that, there was also devil statues lying around the house. There was a huge pink gargoyle outside of the house. The house was also decorated with skulls, real human skulls, because Charles, in his work, when he left, he actually took 2 human skulls with him and 12,000 doses of LSD. And then there was also this pretty creepy painting on the wall, and I call it creepy because it is, and you will realize why it's creepy at the end of the case. So this painting was the head of a man who was gagged and had 5 bullet wounds in his head. Charles would often tell people that it was a self-portrait, and Charles often joked about the fact that that is how he was going to die. Now, this is pretty significant, so remember this. So because of the way Corpsewood Manor was decorated, all of these rumors started to fly around that the eccentric couple that lived in Corpsewood Manor were devil worshippers. But it actually did turn out that Charles was a Satanist, meaning that he was a member of the Church of Satan. Now, I just want to point out that members of the Church of Satan don't worship Satan. Members of the Church of Satan are actually atheists, and they don't want to be confined to the beliefs of any particular religion. And they use Satan as a symbol for liberty and individualism. And Charles was really drawn to the Church of Satan because of their message about being free from religious confines. And this fitted in well with Charles and what he believed in and how he wanted to live his life. The fact that he wanted to live off grid, the fact that he didn't want to follow social norms of the time, and the fact that he wanted to be in a relationship with Joey and he wanted to be open about it. So yes, Charles was a Satanist, but he wasn't a devil worshipper. People in the town thought that Joey and Charles were these satanic, devil worshipping, doing sacrifices and rituals. And we do have to remember that this case takes place in a very small town in Georgia, and in the 70s and 80s, this is right smack bang in the middle of the satanic panic, and there is also a hell of a lot of homophobia present at the time. So basically what happened, the people in the town, and I shouldn't say everyone, but probably the vast majority of people in this town, heard about these 2 men living in the middle of the woods, living off-grid, the fact that they were both Satanists and they were in a relationship with each other. They just took all of that information and ran with it. And Joey and Charles were labelled as, quote, homosexual devil worshippers. And that is what they were labelled as, and that never left them. So that was the history and all of the rumours of Corpsewood Manor, and I feel like we can all probably imagine what it would have been like. And when I was reading like that bit about Corpsewood and the rumours and everything and the satanic panic, it just reminded me of Stranger Things, the latest season, where everyone is going after Hellfire Club because they think that it's this Satan cult thing. And now we need to go back to Tony and Avery, which feels like forever ago that we were talking about them. So remember I said that Tony and Avery decided to pay a visit to Corpsewood Manor. So Tony and Avery heard about all of these rumours surrounding Corpsewood Manor, about the sex parties, about the devil worshipping, etc. But there was one rumour in particular, and that was not actually a rumour, it was true, that stuck out to Tony and Avery, and that is that Charles would give his guests free alcohol because Charles and Joey made their own wine, and whoever came to their home, they offered them free alcohol. And remember, Tony and Avery basically just drink all day, get high. That is the only thing that is on their mind. So as soon as they heard that rumor that this manor in the middle of the woods was giving out free alcohol, they were like, right, I'm there. Now, there are conflicting sources on exactly what happened on the first visit. So there were some sources that said that Avery actually visited Corpsewood Manor for the first time alone without Tony. Other sources say that Avery and Tony visited the manor for the first time together. But what is rumoured to have happened on at least one of the visits to Corpsewood Manor is that Avery got into some sort of sexual activity with Charles. And this is all according to Avery as well, like he is the source. So I don't know why he would lie, but he does lie, so I don't know. But Avery told Tony that when he visited Corpsewood Manor one time, Charles had offered to perform oral sex on him, to which Avery consensually agreed. Now, when Tony heard about this, he was furious. He was saying things, very homophobic things. He was saying things like, you can't consensually agree to sexual activity with another man. They're going to take advantage of you. I think he was also kind of insinuating that these two devil worshippers in the middle of the woods were going to turn Avery gay, which is obviously absolutely ridiculous. And Tony was saying, we need to do something about this. They're taking advantage of you. We need to deal with this. We need to get revenge. And as well, there was another rumor. Tony had also heard that Joey and Charles were rich. Tony thought to himself, well, they're living in this huge mansion in the middle of the woods. They're living off grid. They don't pay taxes or bills or anything like that. They clearly don't trust authorities, which means they clearly don't trust the banks. And because they have a lot of money, they must store their money on their property. And Tony, being the stand-up citizen that he was, thought to himself, well, I want that money for myself, so I'm going to rob them as well. And this is when Tony came up with the awful plan that Avery and Tony were going to turn up at Corpsewood Manor. They were going to hold Joey and Charles at gunpoint and rob them. It really did escalate that quickly. It's ridiculous, but we have to remember the kind of person we're dealing with here. Tony has tried to murder 2 family members already. It's not really surprising when you remember that. And Avery, I told you he wasn't innocent. He was all down for this plan. He was like, yep, okay, let's go. But unfortunately, it wouldn't just be a robbery. Oh no. Because it turns out that Tony's plan was much worse, and this would lead to the terrible, tragic events of today's case. So on the night of the 12th of December 1982, Avery arms himself with a knife and a rifle, and he gets into the car with Tony. And the two of them start making their way towards Corpsewood Manor. And then for some strange reason, Tony decides to pick up 2 more people on the way. He picks up his 17-year-old nephew, Joey Wells, and his date for the evening, 17-year-old Teresa Hudgens. Now, it's not really known why Tony decided to pick up his nephew and his date, because they were not involved in the plan whatsoever. They did not know what was going to happen. So the story is that Tony was supposed to accompany his nephew on his first date with Teresa. Yes, Teresa and Joey Wells. It's very confusing because there's another Joey. I think we'll just call the other Joey Wells, like by his last name, so it doesn't get too confusing. So yes, Wells and Teresa were really on a first date, and they had no idea what was going to happen. So the four of them are now in the car heading to Corpsewood Manor. Obviously, Avery and Tony know exactly what the plan is, but Wells and Teresa just think that they're heading to Corpsewood Manor for a party, for a good time. So eventually when they arrive, they knock on the door and Charles answers. And Charles greets the four of them like he was greeting old friends. This is how Charles greeted everyone. He welcomed everyone into his home. He invited them into the chicken house up to the pink room, which is what he did with all guests, but very tragically, Charles would have no idea what was going to happen. So Charles goes with the four guests up to the pink room and Joey decides to stay behind in the main house to look after the dogs. So Charles and the four guests are in the pink room and they're having a good time. Charles has offered them all drinks when all of a sudden Avery jumps up and says, I need to get more Tootaloo from the car. Now remember, Tootaloo is that mixture of paint thinner and glue, but he's not actually going back to the car to get Tootaloo because he's actually going to get his rifle. Now when Avery returns to the pink room holding a rifle, Charles sees him holding the rifle and Charles has had a little bit to drink at this point and he obviously has no idea what Tony and Avery are planning. He has no reason to be suspicious and he sees the rifle and he just says, oh, haha, bang, bang. Now, Avery doesn't quite know how to respond to this, so he puts the rifle down and diffuses the tension a little bit. But then moments later, Avery jumps up with the knife in his hand and he holds Charles at knife point and he starts shouting, where is the money? Tell me where the money is. And at this point, all chaos breaks loose. Tony picks up the rifle. He points that at Charles. Then we have Wells and Teresa, who are also in the room, that don't have a clue what is going on. They are screaming, shouting. They are scared. Tony and Avery just keep repeatedly shouting, where is the money? Tell me where the money is. But it turns out there was no money in the house. Charles actually did have $40,000 to his name, but it was all in the bank. And Charles just kept saying, I don't have any money here. Look at the way we live. We live off the land. Why would I need money? Meanwhile, Tony's nephew Wells is just begging Tony to stop. Teresa is still screaming hysterically in the background. And amazingly, even though Charles is the one being held at knife point, Charles is trying to reassure Teresa. He is trying to say to her, are you okay? Like, it's going to be okay. And it's just unbelievable. That is the kind of person that Charles was. He was more concerned about Teresa than himself. And at this point, Tony and Avery are just completely fed up with Charles at this point because Charles won't tell them where the money is because there is none, but they don't want to hear that. So they decide to tie him up and gag him using bed sheets from the pink room. And it was at this moment that Avery turns to Charles and says, fine, whatever, don't tell us where the money is. I'm going to go to the main house and maybe your partner Joey will tell me. And very sadly, this is where things take a very tragic turn. Avery takes the rifle off Tony and makes his way into the main house, leaving Charles tied up and gagged in the pink room along with Tony, Wells and Teresa. Avery enters the main house alone and he finds Joey in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, and Joey is in the kitchen with the two dogs. And this is when Avery points his rifle at Joey. Now, it's not exactly known what happens. There is clearly an exchange between Avery and Joey, but we don't know what it is. But the next thing we know is that back in the pink room, Charles, Tony, Wells and Teresa hear 4 gunshots because very sadly back in the main house, Avery had opened fire on Joey and Avery shot Joey multiple times in the head. And very sadly, this is where Joey Odom lost his life. But it wasn't just Joey that lost their life in the main house because Avery then turned his rifle onto the two dogs. Why? Like, why kill Joey and why kill the two dogs? Following the cold-blooded murders, Avery makes his way back to the pink room and he just looks at Charles and almost in a taunting way, he says, I just killed that man and the two dogs. And it's said that at this moment, the life just drained out of Charles's face. Joey and those two dogs were his whole world and they were just taken from him like that. But Avery and Tony were not finished, were they? Next, they decided to drag Charles out of the pink room and drag him into the main house. And once Charles steps into the main house, he sees the horror scene in front of him. He sees Joey dead on the floor. He sees his two dogs. Can you even imagine what that would have been like for Charles, the love of his life, his 2 dogs, his whole world. And at this point, Charles had managed to break free of his gag and he just let out a heartbroken scream. He was then forced to sit on the couch and Avery and Tony were still not letting it drop. Where is the money? Tell me where the money is. But Charles was no longer interested in interacting with them. His whole world had just been taken away from him. He didn't care anymore. And he was ignoring them and he just went and crawled to be by Joey. He just wanted to be by Joey. And as he crawled to be next to Joey's body, Charles said, I asked for this. And it was at this moment that Tony, who now has the rifle, walked up to Charles and shot him multiple times in the head. And now Dr. Charles Scudder has also lost his life. And I think what is the most heartbreaking thing about this case is the final moments of Charles and what he had to go through. He had to listen to Joey and his 2 dogs being shot because he could hear the shots from the pink room, and then he was forced into the main house to see them. Charles was a very open person. He was very friendly. He was very welcoming, and he welcomed Tony and Avery into his home as guests, as friends. And Tony and Avery are just pure evil. They're just evil. And you would think that that would be the end of this case, wouldn't you? But oh no, no. Unbelievably, we still have one more victim. So after also brutally murdering Charles, Tony and Avery jumped into action and they ransacked Corpsewood Manor. They were trying to take anything of value. They took a few pieces of jewelry, some coins, basically anything that had any kind of value in it. And then because Tony's car wouldn't start, they also decided to steal Charles's Jeep. But before driving off in Charles's Jeep, Tony takes Teresa into a room and tries to rape her. Thankfully, he actually didn't manage to rape her. Teresa managed to get away. And Tony just bundled his nephew Wells and Teresa into the car and the 4 of them drove off. So they have fled the scene, but do they let Teresa go? Oh no. Instead, they drop Teresa off at Tony's sister's house where they plan to hold her captive so she can't go to the police. And I don't know what happens to Wells. I assume they let him go because he's family, and I don't know what happens to him, so I can't tell you anything. But Tony and Avery don't plan on sticking around because they are so scared that the police are going to catch up to them. So they both flee in Charles's car. And they just get to the state line when they realize that they need to change cars. They can't be driving Charles's Jeep around, plus his Jeep is pretty unique, so it's going to be easily recognizable. So they decide they need to change vehicles. And ultimately, it was this decision that now leads to another tragic event. So on the night of the 13th of December 1982, which was just a day after the murders at Corpsewood Manor, Tony and Avery pull into a rest stop. They decide to stay and scope out the vehicles, see which one is going to be the best for them to steal. And in the parking lot, they spot a Toyota with a man inside, and that man is asleep. And Tony and Avery think, perfect, he is on his own, he's going to be vulnerable, let's go steal his car. But the man inside was 26-year-old Navy Lieutenant Kirby Phelps. Tony pulls out the gun and knocks on the window and forces Kirby Phelps out of the car. Tony then walks him over to kind of like a little woodland area, and he ties Lieutenant Kirby Phelps to a tree whilst Avery is getting to work stealing the car. But as Tony is tying Kirby Phelps to the tree, Kirby manages to throw a punch, and he actually manages to escape a little bit, but in response to this, Tony pulls out his gun and shoots him 3 times in the head. And now tragically, Lieutenant Kirby Phelps has also lost his life. And it's just unbelievable. I just can't believe it. All of these murders are absolutely senseless, but especially this one, like why? I just feel like with Tony anyway, he is a potential serial killer at this point. He technically has murdered 3 people now because obviously he murdered his 2-year-old nephew. Don't forget that. He has also murdered Charles, and now he has murdered Kirby. I think in the circumstances of the murders, you couldn't class him as a serial killer, and obviously there was basically no cool down period between Charles and Kirby. But I do feel like he is a potential serial killer, and thank God this case is coming to an end and he didn't become one. So Tony and Avery are now on the run again, and they are in that Toyota that they stole, and they make it all the way to Texas, and they stay in Texas for a few days. Meanwhile, back in Georgia, Teresa has managed to escape. She is held captive for 4 days, and as soon as she escapes, she goes straight to the police to tell them everything. The police discover the murder scene at Corpsewood Manor, and immediately arrest warrants are issued for Avery and Tony. And finally, after 8 days of being on the run, Tony and Avery just got fed up. They actually both started to turn against each other. They were arguing. They also ran out of money, and they just felt like they had nowhere to go and the police were closing in on them. They had split up at this point because they were fed up with each other. Avery handed himself in Georgia, and Tony handed himself in Tennessee. And after they handed themselves in, they both confessed to all of their crimes, and they are both charged with the murder of Charles Scudder, Joey Odom, and Lieutenant Kirby Phelps. But is that the end of the story? Of course not. Because there is one more unbelievable thing about this case, and this is where the homophobia of the town and also the satanic panic plays into it. Because when the case went to trial and people started to hear about the murders and what had happened, people were actually on the side of Tony and Avery. Let that sink in. People were actually glad that Tony and Avery had killed the quote devil worshipping homosexuals. Tony stated that he was just acting in self-defense. These devil worshippers were trying to attack me, and people believed him. People actually believed that he was acting in self-defense. People believed that Charles and Joey were these evil Satanists and they were performing these devil rituals and sacrifices, and thank God they've gone. And honestly, it makes my blood boil. It literally is disgusting. But it wasn't just the general public that were biased and had these views, because it was also the sheriff's department. Because when they were investigating the crime scene, they knew about the rumors, they knew about Joey and Charles's relationship. They thought that they were devil worshippers. They found the pink room. They thought, oh yeah, these two have sex parties and they're also Satanists. So then the sheriff's office was also calling them devil worshippers and fueling the flames of the homophobia and the satanic panic. Even with all of this BS and the rumors and the victim blaming going on, the evidence was overwhelming against Tony and Avery. Teresa and Tony's nephew Wells also testified at trial because obviously they were there. They knew what happened, and they are the biggest reason why we all now know what exactly happened on that night. And Tony's BS self-defense story was also picked apart by the prosecution, and thankfully Tony and Avery were found guilty of 3 counts of murder, and both of them were sentenced to life in prison. And thankfully, to this very day, Tony West and Avery Brock are still in prison. And as for Corpsewood Manor, well, in 1983, just after the trial ended, Corpsewood Manor mysteriously burnt down, and no one knows who set the manor on fire. It was obviously arson, but no one knows who did it. Both the main house and the chicken house were destroyed. There are still remains of the house. You can actually go and see the remains. They're still there, but pretty much the majority of the house was burnt down. And I just feel like that is so sad, because Charles and Joey put their life into that house. They built that house brick by brick, and someone just burnt it down. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to believe that the people that were victim blaming in the town, that were glad that these devil worshippers were dead, I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that they were probably responsible. And because some of the remains of Corpsewood Manor still stand today, it's actually a pretty popular destination for people to visit, and a lot of people have visited. And in the decades that have passed, there have been some spooky stories and encounters, and you can read about them online because there are quite a few. I don't have time to go into every single spooky supernatural story, but there have been reports that you can still hear the screams, that you can still hear the with gunshots. People have even reported that you can hear dogs barking. Others have reported that you can hear Charles's harp playing, because that is something that I actually didn't get into in this case, but Charles did play a number of instruments and he taught himself how to play the harp, and people have said that you can still hear him playing. But there is definitely one other very spooky, weird little coincidence. I don't even know if you want to call it a coincidence, but remember that portrait that was hanging in Corpsewood Manor that Charles would say is a self-portrait? Well, remember that self-portrait was of a man's head who was gagged and shot 5 times in the head, and Charles would tell people, oh, that is how I'm going to die. Well, he actually kind of did die in a very eerily similar way, and that's just so weird that he had this portrait hanging on his wall for years of this man that was gagged and shot in the head, and he would tell people, oh yeah, that is how I'm going to die. And obviously he would be joking about that, but that is just so weird. And because of that portrait and because of how Charles was murdered, that all fed into the myths and the mystery and the supernatural stories and everything surrounding Corpsewood Manor. People actually do believe that Charles had a premonition and predicted his own death. So if any of you live in Georgia and near Tryon, which is the local town that Corpsewood Manor is near, have you visited? Let me know. Do any of you have stories? Let us all know in the comments. But anyway, past all of the myths and the haunted stories surrounding Corpsewood Manor, there is a real story behind all of this. Charles Scudder was described as a friendly, caring man who would welcome anyone into his home and make them feel welcome. He loved spending time out in nature with his dogs and Joey, and he just wanted to live out the rest of his life in peace. He was only 56 years old. Joey Odom was described as the type of person who would do anything to help anyone. He had a huge passion for cooking. He loved preparing food on his wooden stove, and he loved spending time with Charles and their dogs. He was only 44 years old. Lieutenant Kirby Phelps was described as an incredibly hard worker and a caring young man. He had joined the Navy to follow in his late father's footsteps, and in December of 1982, he was traveling home to spend Christmas with his mother. He was then tragically murdered in the most senseless way, and he was only 26 years old. And then of course we have to remember the 2 dogs because they were also murdered. It's just, oh god. So as always, let me know your thoughts, theories and opinions, and if any of you have visited Corpsewood Manor, please let me know your experience. Don't forget to let me know your case suggestions as well, because I always want to know what you want to hear next. Thank you again to G5 Games for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget you can download Sherlock using the link in my description box. And that is it from me, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.